Jack Thornton sat alone in the dim light of his cabin, the fire crackling weakly against the biting cold of the winter evening outside. The wind howled through the barren prairie, rattling the thin window panes and sweeping snow across the fence posts inside. The silence was heavier than the storm, pressing down on him like a physical weight since the death of his wife. The world had felt empty, hollow, as if the very walls of his home had absorbed his sorrow in his arms. His baby daughter Clara stirred and cried, a small, wailing sound that seemed to echo endlessly through the cabin. Jack shifted her slightly, trying to soothe her with the only comfort he could offer, warmth. But she wanted more than warmth. She wanted food, care, and the presence of a mother who could no longer be there. Jack's hand shook as he clumsily rocked her back and forth. Realizing that he was unprepared for the total responsibility now resting on him, he glanced at the empty crib, at the tiny clothes folded neatly on a shelf, all reminders of the life that had been snatched away from him, memories of his wife. Sarah flashed unbidden through his mind, her gentle smile, the way she hummed as she cooked, the softness of her hands as she soothed Clara. Each memory was a stab of longing and regret, a reminder of what he had lost and what he had to face alone. Jack was a man used to hardships. He had spent years taming horses, mending fences, and surviving harsh winters on the prairie, but grief was different. Grief had no predictable rhythm or pattern, and it could not be tamed with strength alone. He found himself staring at the fire, unable to think clearly. Overwhelmed by the dual weight of sorrow and responsibility, Clara's tiny hands clutched at his chest, her soft coos and whimpers piercing the fog of his thoughts. He tried to prepare some food for her, but his own appetite had vanished with Sarah's passing. The small pantry offered little beyond a few dry rations, and even the thought of cooking for himself felt impossible. His hands fumbled with the small tin of oats, spilling some onto the floor as he muttered under his breath. Clara's crying intensified, echoing in the empty cabin, and Jack felt a pang of helplessness unlike anything he had known on the ranch. In that silence, he confronted his own fear, the fear of failing his daughter, of not being enough, of enduring a world that seemed too cruel to navigate alone. He had survived storms, wild animals, and long, lonely nights on the open prairie. But this profound loneliness was a test of the heart rather than the body. As the evening wore on, Jack held Clara close, rocking her with a slow, rhythmic motion, whispering the promises he could barely believe. I'll keep you safe, I'll keep you fed, I'll do my best. The words felt fragile even as he spoke them, and he wondered if they would ever be enough outside. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, a different kind of storm brewed, the struggle of a man learning how to navigate grief, fatherhood, and the terrifying quiet of life after loss. And in the midst of that silence, a faint knock echoed through the cabin door. Jack froze, his heart catching in his chest. It was a sound unfamiliar in his solitude, a ripple across the still waters of his grief. Who could possibly come at this hour, in this storm, to this isolated cabin on the prairie? The fire flickered as he set Clara down carefully in her crib. Wiping his hands on his coat, the wind howled louder, as if in anticipation, and Jack walked slowly toward the door, unaware that this single knock would mark the beginning of a change he had never dared to hope for. The wind howled around Jack Thornton's cabin like an unrelenting drum, rattling the thin wooden walls and swirling the snow into sharp drifts against the porch inside. The fire struggled to hold its warmth, and Jack sat hunched near the hearth, Clara cradled in his arms. The baby's cries had quieted for a moment, her tiny fingers curled against his chest, but the weight of responsibility pressed down on him like the cold itself. He had grown accustomed to solitude, but tonight it felt suffocating. Every sound outside, a branch creaking, the snow crunching against the porch, made him tense. And then, faint but clear, came a new sound, A knock at the door. Jack froze. His heart thumped in his chest. Who could possibly be outside in this storm? Visitors were rare on the prairie, and strangers even rarer. He glanced down at Clara, asleep now against his shoulder, and a pang of fear stabbed through him. He didn't know what to expect, but instinct told him to be cautious. He set Clara down carefully in her crib, smoothing the small blanket over her, and took a deep breath, pulling on his coat. He stepped cautiously to the door. The knocking came again, a little more insistent, and he reached for the latch when he opened the door. The sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. A woman stood in the snow, bundled in a heavy coat and scarf, carrying a small basket. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, and her eyes shone with a combination of determination and concern. She smiled gently, though her teeth were chattering, and extended the basket toward him. "Good evening," she said softly. "I thought you might need this." Jack blinked. Unsure how to respond, he wanted to retreat into his protective silence, to tell her to go away, to keep this stranger from seeing the raw edges of his grief, yet something in her presence, the calm kindness in her eyes, the small warmth she radiated, stopped him from shutting the door. What is this?" he asked cautiously, his voice rough from disuse. "Food," she said simply, holding the basket out. "I heard about your loss, and I thought you might need some help. I brought bread, stew, and a few fresh eggs." Jack stared at her, feeling a mix of disbelief, suspicion, and an unfamiliar stirring of hope. He had grown so accustomed to doing everything alone that the idea of accepting help felt both comforting and terrifying. The storm outside was harsh, yet here was warmth at his doorstep, offered without demand or expectation. I don't know what to say," he admitted finally. Why would you come all this way?" She shrugged lightly. "Because no one should have to face the cold alone, and a hungry child shouldn't be left without food." Her gaze softened as she looked at Clara, whose tiny face peeked over the crib's edge. "She's precious. You're doing the best you can." Jack felt a lump rise in his throat. The words were gentle, yet powerful, striking at a heart long hardened by loss. He wanted to trust her, to accept the gift, but old fears whispered that no kindness came without strings attached. He glanced down at the basket, the warmth of the food mingling with the warmth that seemed to flow from her presence. Finally, he nodded, stepping aside. "Come in." Then quickly, "Before the cold takes you." She smiled again, stepping inside. Brushing snow from her coat, the cabin felt smaller, cozier, alive in a way it hadn't in months. The fire crackled, and the scent of bread and stew began to fill the room. Clara stirred, sensing the new presence, and Jack felt a surprising sense of relief wash over him for the first time since his wife's passing. He realized that he did not have to face the winter or his grief entirely alone outside. The storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, a fragile warmth had begun to grow, one born not just of food and fire, but of unexpected compassion. The following days unfolded like the slow thaw after a harsh winter. Jack Thornton had always been a man of action, skilled with horses, fences, and the chores of ranch life, but he had never truly cared for a child alone. With his wife gone, every task seemed heavier, every small mistake amplified by the weight of responsibility. Clara's hunger and restlessness reminded him constantly of what he lacked: experience, patience, and the soft touch of someone who could guide him. Mary, the woman who had knocked at his door, stayed at first. Jack had been unsure, wary of her motives, hesitant to accept help he had long convinced himself he didn't need, but she moved quietly through the cabin, her presence neither overbearing nor intrusive. She cooked, cleaned, and offered gentle guidance on feeding and caring for Clara. She taught him how to prepare porridge without spilling it, how to soothe the baby when she cried inconsolably, and how to read her little cues. the tiny curl of her fingers, the small wriggle in her sleep. The soft sigh of satisfaction after a meal. Jack watched her carefully, learning through observation as much as instruction. At first, he remained rigid and silent, responding with clipped words or a nod, but Clara responded immediately, her small face lighting up when Mary spoke or touched her. Her laughter and babbles, once rare and fleeting, began to fill the cabin, echoing through the cold wooden walls and chipping away at the shadow of grief that had settled there one morning. Jack and Mary worked side by side in the kitchen. He stirred a pot of stew while she kneaded dough for bread. The fire crackled, throwing golden light across the room. Clara sat nearby in a high chair, fascinated by their movements. Reaching her tiny hands toward the flower-covered table, Jack felt something unfamiliar, a sense of connection, of teamwork, of being part of something larger than himself. "See?" Mary said gently, wiping a streak of flour from his cheek. "She's watching, learning, and remembering. She notices everything." Jack nodded slowly. I don't want to mess this up." "You won't," Mary assured him. "You're already doing better than you realize sometimes. The hardest part is just showing up." Her words sank deep into him. He realized that his grief had been isolating him, not just from the world, but from Clara. He had been so focused on what he had lost that he hadn't noticed what he still had: a living, breathing child who needed him, and someone willing to help him rise to the challenge as the days passed. Jack found himself opening up more, not just to Mary, but to the process of care itself. He learned how to soothe Clara with soft humming, how to anticipate her needs, and how to balance his own exhaustion with hers. The cabin, once a place of silence and sorrow, began to hum with life. Morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating flour-dusted counters, small toys scattered across the floor, and the subtle smile that had begun to form on Jack's face by the end of the week. A routine had been established. Jack would rise before dawn to feed Clara and tend to the chores, while Mary prepared breakfast and offered guidance on both parenting and practical matters. The bond between them grew quietly but steadily, founded on shared labor, patience, and the unspoken acknowledgement of grief and resilience. For the first time since his wife's passing, Jack felt a fragile hope. He realized that trust was not weakness, and accepting help was not a concession but a choice, one that allowed him to be a better father and a more complete man. Clara's laughter, Mary's warmth, and even the simple routine of daily chores became proof that life could continue, even after loss. And as he watched Mary softly cradle Clara for the first time, Jack understood that healing was not a solitary endeavor. It came from shared struggles, quiet support, and the courage to open one's heart again, even as the days grew brighter and the cabin felt warmer. Jack Thornton could not shake the unease that had begun to creep into his heart. The routines of care, the gentle guidance Mary offered, and the laughter of Clara were soothing. Yes, but they also forced him to confront feelings he had long buried: fear, pride, and the fragile vulnerability that came with trusting another person. Jack had spent his life relying on himself. Ranching had taught him resilience, independence, and a stubborn determination to face hardship head-on. But grief, he realized, was unlike any storm he had weathered. It was quieter, insidious, and unrelenting. The absence of his wife had left him raw, exposed, and unprepared for the tenderness he now saw in Mary's actions at times. He found himself questioning her motives. Why was she here? Why had she chosen to help them, out of all people? The prairie was vast, its isolation offering little reason for strangers to intervene in someone else's private sorrow. His mind spun with possibilities, some hopeful, some darker, perhaps. She was a well-meaning neighbor. Perhaps she had her own reasons he could not yet understand. Perhaps he dreaded the thought there was some ulterior motive he was not seeing. Jack wrestled with these thoughts silently, Not wanting to voice them aloud, to do so would betray a lack of trust, and yet he could not completely banish the doubt. He found himself retreating into moments of solitude, wandering the snow-covered yard alone, thinking through every interaction, every smile, every touch Mary offered. He wanted to believe he truly did. But the old habits of self-reliance were hard to break. Mary, however, seemed to sense his hesitation without needing to question it directly. She moved with patience, never pressing, never demanding. When Jack faltered while feeding Clara, she offered a gentle word when he misread the baby's cues. She guided him quietly. Her kindness was consistent, without expectation, without judgment, slowly. Her presence became a mirror, reflecting the man he could be, patient, attentive, capable. If only he allowed himself to embrace her help. Even so, doubt lingered, feeding off his pride and fear. Accepting her guidance felt to him like admitting weakness, letting someone else into his life, into the delicate balance he had struggled to maintain after his wife's passing. Felt almost like betrayal. He worried that the ranching community would whisper behind his back, questioning why he accepted help. He feared that reliance on another would somehow diminish his role as Clara's father, as though accepting kindness were a concession to failure. One evening, Jack sat by the fire, Clara asleep in her crib, and Mary quietly mending a tear in the baby's blanket. He studied her face by the flickering light, noting the patience in her eyes, the care in her hands, and the warmth she radiated without thought of reward. A realization dawned on him. The wall of doubt he had built around his heart was both protection and prison. By clinging to independence, he had also closed himself off from the very support that could help him heal and help Clara thrive. He took a deep breath. Letting the tension ease slightly from his shoulders, he realized that accepting help was not a sign of weakness, but an act of courage, a deliberate choice to trust, to allow kindness to enter a life that had been hollowed by grief. The thought of sharing responsibility, of being part of a small circle of care, became less frightening and more necessary. Jack looked at Mary, her hands gentle on the blanket, and Clara, her tiny chest rising and falling in peaceful sleep. The cabin, once a silent refuge of sorrow, now felt alive with possibility. He whispered softly to himself, a promise and an acknowledgement. I will trust, I will allow help. I will not let pride keep me from what we all needing. That quiet realization, the first true warmth seeped into Jack's heart, not from fire, nor from food, nor even from hope alone, but from the understanding that vulnerability could be the foundation of strength. Winter had begun to loosen its grip on the prairie, and with the early hints of spring came a new challenge for Jack Thornton. Though he had slowly begun to trust Mary and accept her help, the outside world had not paused in its harshness. Neighbors' whispers, subtle glances from those who prided themselves on independence, and the occasional harsh comment about his reliance on a stranger reminded Jack that trust came at a cost. At least in the eyes of the community. One crisp morning, Clara fell ill. Her tiny body shivered beneath the blankets, and her soft whimpers pierced Jack's heart like knives. Panic clawed at him. Though Mary had been patient in teaching him how to care for his daughter, nothing could prepare him for the stark fear of illness in someone so small, so fragile. Jack paced the cabin, wringing his hands, while Mary gently checked Clara's temperature, murmuring soothing words. "This is just a fever," she said calmly, brushing back a strand of Jack's unruly hair. "We'll take care of her. You're not alone." Jack's chest tightened. Not alone. The words, simple as they were, resonated deeply. For weeks, he had been carrying grief and responsibility entirely on his own. To hear her say he wasn't alone, to feel her quiet presence offering support rather than criticism, was both comforting and terrifying. Could he fully rely on someone else? Could he trust that she would be there if things worsened? The community's skepticism did not help a neighbor stopped by uninvited. Offering unsolicited advice and thinly veiled judgment. "You're lucky someone stepped in," he said with a smirk. Glancing at Mary, "Most men would have handled it themselves." Jack clenched his jaw, feeling the sting of pride and the weight of societal expectation, but Mary's calm remained. Unshaken, she tended to Clara with steady hands, prepared a warm broth, and reminded Jack gently to rest. She did not chastise him for his worry, nor did she undermine his role as a father. Instead, she guided him, showing that trust was not about surrendering control, but about partnership, a shared effort toward a common goal. As Clara's fever slowly subsided, Jack found himself reflecting on his own fears. The storm outside and the harsh voices of neighbors were nothing compared to the inner walls he had built around his heart. He realized that the test he faced was not only about trusting Mary to help with a sick child, it was about trusting her, trusting that kindness, care, and compassion could exist without strings attached. Later that evening, as the fire crackled and Clara slept peacefully in her crib, Jack approached Mary, his voice tentative but earnest. I don't know how to thank you, not just for her, but for everything. I've been so afraid to let someone in, afraid I'd fail again if I relied on anyone." Mary smiled softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Jack, trusting someone doesn't mean you failed. It means you care enough to let others help you carry the burden. You're already doing more than enough for Clara. Letting me help just makes it easier for all of us." It was a revelation. Jack realized that life was not a solitary endeavor. The cowboy who had prided himself on independence understood, perhaps for the first time, that strength could coexist with vulnerability. By leaning on Mary, he was not surrendering control but expanding his capacity to care, to protect, and to love. The test of trust had arrived not through grand gestures or life-threatening danger, but in the quiet, everyday acts of care and compassion. By stepping forward, by allowing himself to rely on another, Jack had proven his courage in a way that pride alone could never have achieved. That night, as he watched Mary cradle Clara in her arms, Jack felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the warmth of trust realized, of fear confronted, and of a fragile, growing family beginning to take shape in the aftermath of grief. Spring had begun to stretch its first tentative fingers across the prairie, softening the harshness of winter with a gentle sun and the subtle greening of the fields. For Jack Thornton, the landscape mirrored the transformation in his own life. The cabin, once cold and silent, now radiated warmth, filled with laughter, care, and the quiet hum of daily life shared. Clara, his baby daughter, was thriving. Her small hands reached eagerly for the world around her, her giggles echoing through the cabin like chimes in a gentle breeze. Jack marveled at her growth, realizing that, like the prairie recovering from winter, she was resilient and full of promise. And alongside her, Mary had become more than just a helper. She was a partner in the truest sense, an anchor in his life and a steadying presence for both father and child. Jack reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from the first hesitant knock at his cabin door during a bitter storm, through the tentative days of learning and shared struggle, to the testing of trust when Clara had fallen ill. The path had been steep and uncertain. He remembered the walls of fear and pride he had built around himself, the doubts that had gnawed at his heart, and the silent resistance he had felt at letting anyone into his life. Yet, each moment had been a step forward, a step toward connection, toward family, toward hope. Mary moved gracefully around the cabin, preparing breakfast while keeping an eye on Clara. As she played on a small blanket spread across the floor, the firelight glinted in her hair, and Jack could not help but feel a deep gratitude. It was a gratitude not born of obligation, but of recognition of the patience, understanding, and unwavering kindness she had offered without expectation. she had entered their lives like a spark in the cold. And in time, that spark had ignited a lasting warmth. Jack joined her at the table, sitting with a cup of steaming coffee in his hands, and looked out the window at the prairie beyond. Snow patches still clung stubbornly to the ground, but the promise of new growth was everywhere. He realized that life, like the land, could recover from devastation, and just as the prairie would bloom again, so too could hearts. Even after grief and loss, the days now followed a rhythm that was comforting in its simplicity. Jack tended to the ranch chores while Mary cared for Clara, but their roles often blended seamlessly. They shared meals, laughter, and quiet conversations, learning the contours of each other's personalities, building trust, and weaving a web of connection that neither had anticipated. The cabin was no longer a place of isolation but a home, a sanctuary where love, compassion, and hope were tangible forces shaping every moment. One afternoon, Jack held Clara in his arms as she napped. Feeling the steady rise and fall of her tiny chest, he glanced at Mary, who was reading quietly nearby, and realized that the fear that had once gripped his heart was gone. He was no longer a man paralyzed by grief, isolated by circumstance, or burdened by pride. He had learned that strength and vulnerability could coexist, that asking for help was not weakness, and that trust could blossom into family. He whispered softly to himself, a promise carried on the warm spring breeze. "We'll be all right. We'll make it together." Clara stirred, smiling in her sleep, and Mary looked up, meeting his gaze with a knowing warmth. No words were needed. The silence between them was full of understanding and quiet joy. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly, full of life and color inside. The cabin glowed with the warmth of fire, laughter, and love. Jack, Mary, and Clara had weathered grief, fear, and doubt, and emerged not just intact, but stronger, united, and full of hope. The cowboy who had once sat alone with a hungry child had found something more than survival. He had found the beginnings of a family, the promise of tomorrow, and the enduring warmth of a home. And as the sun climbed higher, illuminating both the cabin and the vast prairie beyond, Jack knew, with a certainty born of hard-won experience, that this was truly a new beginning.